Hello everyone, and welcome back to Player One Start. Today we are continuing the Ultimate Sega CD review. In the last video in this series, we took a look at the history and development of the hardware, and we talked about a little bit about why this add-on really even exists. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the hardware and take a look at graphics and sound. And to tell you the truth, graphics and sound is what this add-on is all about. It was meant to increase the capabilities of the Sega Genesis, as well as accommodate the massive storage medium of CDs, providing up to about 320 times the capacity for games. But to fully understand the advantages of the Sega CD, we have to take a look at the hardware. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The Sega CD received several variations during its lifetime, of which Sega constructed 3 different models. The original model, also known as the Model 1, utilized a front-loading motorized disc tray that sat underneath the original Sega Genesis. These units are becoming much more rare and harder to find for game collectors, and as such, I do not own one in my collection. However, you can see that the front of the Sega CD has no buttons or ports to use. All of the control is handled through the Sega Genesis and its controllers. The CD tray itself slides out for you to place a disc on. To open the disc tray, you actually have to press the reset button on the Sega Genesis. You can press the button again to close it, or just give the tray a little push and it'll automatically close. To the right of the tray are 2 lights, Ready and Access. The Ready light will turn green when the system is turned on and everything is functioning properly, and the Access light will blink red whenever the system is reading a disc. On the back, it has 3 ports. There's the Sega CD RCA Stereo Out, which runs stereo sound over RCA Composite out of the back of the Sega CD, and next to that is the Sega CD Audio Line In. This port is used with the audio mixing cable that is plugged into the original Sega Genesis Model 1 at the headphone jack. And lastly, there's the power port. That's right, the Sega CD and the Sega Genesis require 2 separate power supplies. Taking a look inside the Model 1, you can see some of the hardware which makes this console tick. First item of note is the main CPU, which is a 12.5 MHz 16-bit Motorola 68000 processor. It runs about 5 MHz faster than the Sega Genesis processor. It contains 1 megabit of boot ROM allocated for the CD game BIOS, CD player software, and compatibility with CD plus G discs. 6 megabits of RAM are allocated to data for programs, pictures, and sounds. 512 kilobits of PCM waveform memory. 128 kilobits for CD-ROM data cache memory. On the other side of the processor, you'll notice the GPU, which is clocked at about 6.25 MHz. And an additional 64 kilobits are allocated as the backup memory. However, this can be upgraded to up to 1 megabit by using a backup RAM cartridge. However, even that wasn't released until towards the end of the console's life cycle, and hence is also rare today. Taking a look at the Sega CD Model 2, you can see that there are some minor changes made. Most notably, they got rid of the motorized tray and replaced it with a lid mechanism. When plugged into the Sega Genesis Model 2, it is no longer required to have the Sega Genesis headphone jack plug into the Sega CD's audio in port to mix the audio from both the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD. Taking a look inside, you can see how they were able to reduce cost by reducing the size of the motherboard and combining some of the chips. One thing to note on this console that since game saves are saved in battery-backed RAM, it will be necessary to replace this battery, or else you'll lose all your game saves in the future. So the biggest and perhaps most obvious upgrade that the Sega CD provides to the Genesis is the fact that it can include full motion video. Now I've heard a lot of people make fun of that term, full motion video, as opposed to video that isn't in full motion. Well, believe it or not, it's called full motion video for a reason. Here's an example of a video that is not in full motion. So I guess this would be considered not full motion video because the frame rate's kind of bad, but according to Wikipedia, full motion video is a video game narration technique that relies upon pre-recorded video files rather than sprites, vectors, or 3D models to display action within a game. So I guess based on that definition, this too would be full motion video. So yes, that is a video file, but as you can tell, you take steps through different stilled images. So not all video was full motion, and the fact that you said that video was in full motion meant that you had a frame rate that would provide you with video that looked like it was in motion. You know, that may seem kind of crazy today to specify it as full motion video, but back in the mid to early 1990s, there were a lot of videos that were like that still image one that I showed you. In fact, that particular video was from 1996 on a PC game. So full motion video was something you could tout in your advertising as something being superior to your competition. However, full motion video wasn't the only upgrade that the Sega CD provided the Sega Genesis. In fact, it also provided it with scaling and rotation effects as well as an expanded color palette. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. Looking at the graphical capabilities of the Sega CD, it is interesting to note that this is also combining the capabilities of the Sega Genesis with all of the new hardware in the Sega CD. So in many games, different objects on the screen are rendered by one console or the other. For example, in a lot of full-motion video games, the video is being generated specifically from the Sega CD alone, and any of the HUD elements or on-screen menus and icons will be generated from the Sega Genesis. This made programming for the console a bit more difficult as they had to sync everything up so that it would match what both the Sega CD and the Genesis were drawing at the same time. However, the biggest upgrade that the Sega CD offered in terms of just regular graphics was the scaling and rotation effects. Let's take a look at a few examples from games that use these effects. So the scaling effects are actually very nice. In fact, I think they're done better on the Sega CD than they are on the Super Nintendo, which can only scale and rotate backgrounds. The problem with the scaling and rotation effects is that I couldn't find as many examples of them than I could for full motion video. I mean, full motion video really does steal the show. And maybe that's because it was a lot easier for programmers to just make a full motion video clip and dump that onto the CD than it would be to program a scaling and rotation effect on backgrounds, sprites, and other things. So when I talk about full motion video on a Sega CD, let's take a look at what that looks like. Full motion video was almost its own genre that started on the Sega CD. For a lot of people, this would be the first time that anyone would see computer-generated video on a television screen, and Sega marketed this very heavily in their advertising and their marketing campaigns. And that led to a lot of shock and awe that you can tell has been severely dated. Looking at this footage now versus being in the early 90s are two widely differing perspectives. Mainly the problem is that even though this was the best at the time, they did not age well as it has gotten a lot better. And once you've seen what future generations can do, you really don't want to go back to this unless you're really nostalgic for what the content was. Even still, when I personally go back to look at some of these games that I thought looked really cool and impressive back in the day, I actually wish that the video resolution was a bit better, or I would be wishing for a faster frame rate, or a sharper image, or more colors. It's just something that doesn't really hold up well today, and you don't want to go back to. On the other side, I can see why some people find this very nostalgic, especially when they grew up with it. And I think the only way I can relate to that is the fact that some people like to go back and watch movies that are in black and white, or even silent movies. Sure, the technology has improved, but sometimes the content will make it worth it to go back and just relive through some of these memories. However, in the Sega CD's case, unfortunately, there are a lot of things that were put out that were just a gimmick at the time to get people to buy the game. And the games themselves ended up not being very good. And I think that's why the Sega CD has somewhat gotten a reputation for having a poor game library. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. As mentioned before, the GPU has a clock rate of about 6.25 MHz. The Sega CD is capable of producing 64 on-screen colors at once, however using programming tricks, this limit can be increased to about 128 to 256 colors via raster effects, which basically means swapping out color palettes when drawing pixels on the screen line by line. Building off how the Sega Genesis builds its graphics, the Sega CD uses 5 layered planes. One of them is the Sega CD full motion video layer. On top of that layer, programmers can overlay 3 other layers, using the Sega Genesis hardware being enhanced by the Sega CD, giving them 2 tile layers or background layers and 1 sprite layer. These layers are explained in the graphics section of the Ultimate Sega Genesis review. The Sega CD is capable of producing full motion video from about a quarter of the screen to full screen, using advanced compression schemes and software-based upgrades. With just the Sega CD and the Sega Genesis, the number of on-screen colors can vary between 128 to 256 colors, which may seem like a lot at first, but when you consider that the modern digital cameras in your cell phones make images out of millions of colors, you can tell why the detail on these videos do not look as good. Again, one of the biggest feature enhancements over the Sega Genesis is that the Sega CD can scale and rotate not only background layers, but also sprites. This is based off of Sega's Superscaler technology that they used in the arcades back in the late 80s, early 90s. And although it was seldom used, the Sega CD is also capable of generating 3D polygon graphics, producing 16,000 vertices a second, 5,000 triangles a second, or 4,000 quads a second. This is when running at a screen resolution of 256 by 160 pixels, at around 15 to 30 frames per second. The number of polygons is reduced when using flat shaded polygons, and even more when using texture mapping, dipping to around 2,000 polygons a second, which isn't really that much, but considering what the Sega Genesis could do, this was leaps and bounds above that hardware. So again, most likely due to the fact that full motion video really kind of steals the show, and you can kind of pre-render any background you want and just show it in a video, so you can have graphics that wouldn't really be capable on this system, but you can just render it on another system and then dump the video onto the Sega CD, and suddenly the Sega CD can show it. Since that is a reality on this system, I wasn't able to find any tech demos that really max out the graphical capabilities of this system. If any of you out there are aware of a tech demo that has been created for the Sega CD hardware, please let me know in the comments below. I'd really like to take a look and see what programmers have done to kind of max out what the system is able to do. So since full motion video is a capability of this system, it kind of takes the fun out of the tech demos. However, the Sega CD also has a lot of ports of Sega Genesis titles on it, and a lot of you may ask why. Well, the biggest reason was the upgraded soundtrack. So Sega actually did do a major upgrade to the sound capabilities of the Sega Genesis in terms of music synthesis. So the stock sound chip on the Sega Genesis is not really well suited for sound samples. However, as many game programmers found out, it was probably just easier to record a CD soundtrack of your synthesized music using another platform that you're probably already using. I mean, you could even use professional sound synthesis equipment and just record one big sample and make it a CD audio file. And that would be cheaper and more time effective when programming games.
We're sorry. This disc is not intended for audio playback. It has been manufactured for use on the Sega CD system only. If you have played this recording in error, then please choose CD-ROM now.
Of course, if we were to look at sound, there is a huge advantage that the Sega CD brings to the Sega Genesis, and that is the ability to play full-quality CD audio. And especially for those that don't care for the synth music that the Sega Genesis produces, I think this is a most welcome addition. However, in terms of going over the technology behind it all, it can be a bit boring as there's no really music synthesis going on other than playing some sort of PCM sample. Some games took advantage of this by actually recording either orchestral or live musical renditions of the video game's soundtrack. However, some games just recorded a higher quality version of the synthesized music tracks, sometimes using professional synthesis equipment. When the Sega CD is playing just CD digital audio, it is playing it with 2-channel stereo at a sampling rate of about 44.1 kHz, with 16-bit PCM audio depth. This is the same exact specification as any normal audio CD. However, on top of these 2 sound channels, the Sega CD also has a Rico PCM sampling chip that provides 8 additional sound channels to the Sega Genesis's 10 audio channels. The sounds played are 8-bit mono PCM samples. However, you are allowed to get some stereo support by allowing each channel to have different volumes on both the right and the left channels. The maximum sample rate for synthesized music is 32 kHz, again with the same 16-bit PCM audio depth as normal CD audio. One feature of the hardware of the Sega CD that is actually really nice is the line-level stereo audio they have out through RCA connectors in the back of the console. This is great for not only hooking up to a TV, but also for hooking into a more professional sound system, as it will provide crisper and cleaner audio than having it go through something like a headphone jack. So that said, I'm not going to be comparing the difference between CD sampled audio on here and sampled soundtracks that are synthesized using the Sega CD. I'm just going to show you some examples that are highly regarded of music on the Sega CD. Here are some examples from games that were on the Sega Genesis that got an upgraded soundtrack. Let's compare their soundtracks from the stock Sega Genesis chip to how they sound on the Sega CD. So do I think just an upgraded soundtrack would be worth the extra $200 I would have to spend on the Sega CD to get it, plus buying the game again? No. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of the Sega Genesis sound chip to begin with, and I think there are some beautiful music tracks that were made on that chip, but I don't think it would have been worth it to me to upgrade just for the upgraded sound. So overall, I think the sound upgrade is a good thing on the Sega CD, but I don't really know if it'd be worth it for you to upgrade just for that. So a couple of nitpicks I have with the sound is that it did enable some game developers to, I don't want to say be lazy, but at least be cheap in terms of just synthesizing music and then making a CD track out of it. I mean, if I had CD quality audio, I would try to get as many live performances on there, or at least close to live that I could, or at least do better synthesis than they did. My only other nitpick too is that sometimes the seek time where the game has loaded, but then the Sega CD then has to find the audio track, sometimes it's a big gap. And you'll be playing a level for about 5, maybe even 10 seconds before the music starts playing. So that said, that's actually going to wrap it up for the hardware side. In the next video, we're going to start taking a look at the games, and I'm going to start by looking at the launch games. And just a spoiler alert, a lot of them are not very good. But we'll take a look at some of the good examples of games, as well as some of the ones that people view as mediocre in the next part of this review. So that said, remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like and subscribe button, share with a friend. Remember, you can reach out to me on social media. Leave a comment below about what you guys liked about today's video. Let me know what you guys like to see in the future. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned because I have more content coming. I'll see you all in the next one. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.
You